Hi, Alexander, Shelley, Hank. Welcome in. I hope you're either joining us with coffee or have had your coffee or other beverage of choice, as we're going to talk about some cool stuff today and welcoming you in Allard. For those of you who don't know who Allard is, Allard Buijze is our CTO of AxonIQ. We also know him as the Axon guy, since he's the initial contributor and creator of Axon Framework. So do you have more code now in GitHub or Steven does? I don't know. There's always a
I'm pretty sure it's Steven by now, with all the work that he's been doing on Axon 5.
example.
I kind of gave up. Yeah, I think he surpassed me in the last measurement that I did, and yeah, by now it's there's no way for me to keep up. So
You're not counting anymore, right? You just
yeah.
made peace with that one.
And I realized I could do what he did in some occasions as well. He's very good on code style. And the
Uh-huh.
advantage of doing code style is that you don't actually physically, well, you don't change the actual structure of the code, but still the lines are attributed to you. And that's the way we measure it, the way we just do git blame basically on all the files. So maybe I will just change the code style slightly and
Hey, or you can always add a space and call
yeah,
it good
no,
as
I think the spaces versus tabs discussion might be a good one. I can just
well.
change it to tabs, see how they respond, and change it back to spaces, and then
Or just change the
I'm
whole
back.
style of the project, right? In one go.
Yeah,
There you go.
I mean nowadays you can automate that, and just as long as the commit happens on my name, I'm fine. So I'll get
Yeah.
back. I'll get back on top. Don't
You
worry
get the
about it.
bragging rights there, right? That's what it's all about.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Okay, so speaking of Framework 5, we are talking about a couple of things today, but one major topic, if we call it that, is so Axon as a company, we have been really striving to make event sourcing more accessible to developers, operations, to architects, because we see a lot of benefits in that, right? So we have some tooling, of course, obviously, to make that happen. One thing that we have been focusing on, especially this year, is how can we make event sourcing even more accessible, more easy for folks who have been using it for a while, or those who haven't been using it at all, or new to the whole concept. So with that said, of course, we have the framework and server who serve a really good purpose when it comes to sourcing your events, storing your events, making sure that important information doesn't get lost. But we changed something with Axon Framework 5. We started talking about it a few years ago. It was a
Yep.
little flicker of a concept in the engineers team's mind. And now that concept has turned into reality, which is great. And that is what we call dynamic consistency boundary, or DCB as we call it. So let's talk about that a little bit more. That's
To
the thing in framework 5 and then server.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To put it in a little bit of a perspective, when we talk about making event sourcing easy nowadays, it's the earlier versions of the framework were mostly about making event sourcing possible
Hmm.
or humanly possible, right? Making it accessible or doable in that sense. And but we see a big shift in event sourcing in general, which is the the concept is proving itself very useful, but is also proving itself to be quite hard to do right. And that's a problem. And we see that as a big challenge that we are in a great position as a company with the tooling that we have and the people we have on board to go a step further and not just make it possible for the relatively small group that just automatically understands how it works and gets it. And there's a group that we haven't just hit the right prompt with to get that trigger of that aha moment, right?
Right.
And I think everybody that's usually was my motto in the trainings and in the times where I traveled around the world to mostly give in-person trainings. I always said everybody has this moment where they go aha, And for some of them, it will be on day 1 of the training. Some of them is day 2. And sometimes on day 4, it just happens at the very end. And I've had a few that said after a week, now I got it, right?
Yeah.
I've been thinking, sleeping about it and sleeping on it. And but now, now it's making it more accessible. And we noticed a little over a year ago, I guess a year and a half by now, that there's this one concept that everybody loves and everybody hates. And
do tell us.
It's the aggregates,
The
right?
thing that locks everything.
The thing that pulls everything together. It's like the rug in the Big Lebowski, right? The rug that
Yes.
what was the
It
literal
pulls the room together.
Pulls the room together, yes. But now it's your aggregate that pulls all of your logic together, and unlike a rug, it's stuck to it, right? I mean, at least on a rug you can still move the table, but now the table is stuck.
And without the rug, nothing else makes sense, right? Kind of like the aggregate.
Exactly.
Without it, what do you do?
It's just, furniture starts floating in through the room. That we don't want that. So, and then an aggregate were too many things. And it was actually Sarah Pellegrini who started this discussion. And I still vividly remember my initial response to this idea that she came up with. And it is still the response I get when I post on this about this on LinkedIn.
Is this the naysayers response?
Yeah, can't be done. Aggregate is way too important. It is an essential concept in domain modeling and therefore also in event sourcing.
Right.
Long story short, guess what? It's not. It's not as critical as we think. It does help in certain ways. It doesn't mean, by the way, that we are against the aggregate the way it's designed, described in domain-driven design. That makes perfect sense. And you'll still have pieces of that. But it is not necessary to tie an event source, an event sourcing action to a single aggregate. But it does require quite a bit of rethinking. And it took us quite a while to even reason about all the moving parts that are needed and what do we need to change, what does it look like. So it started with a gut feel and some rakia, because at the time we were on a retreat in Serbia when this happened. Well, that's in Serbia, that's how you solve any problem, right? Problem, rakia, gone.
All right, done.
Well, there's other problems that come back but that's only the next day.
It's all about possibilities, right?
Exactly. You have to
Positive,
open up.
negative. It's just
you have to open up, and it helps. Right. But so we started to experiment with the idea, and by now the experiments have become much more tangible. And actually, there's a milestone release of Axon Framework, Axon Framework 5 milestone 1, where you can already see the initial contours of what DCB will look like and how we're changing the structure of the framework to allow for DCB.
Yeah. And I like that we started on the command side of things, of course, because that's where you get the most benefit and also drawbacks of having an aggregate a lot of times, right?
Exactly.
So that's really great. So what are we hoping to... So let me rephrase, because I know we're hoping to achieve the fact that event sourcing becomes ultimately easier, right? Yeah. But what sort of pitfalls do you see happening along the way as folks start kind of shifting the mindset or wanting to shift the mindset, but then things start getting a little bit sticky for them in terms of, architecturally or even having the business requirements met in a certain way? Where do you see this kind of getting a little bit complicated for people?
There's a few mistakes a lot of people make when venturing into event sourcing. And if you're watching this webinar, anyone, and you want to take one thing away, let it be this one, right? A lot of people take the CRUD mindset and then start implementing event sourcing. Now, in an aggregate, that becomes awkward. Because you'll get something in my aggregate updated, but it will work eventually, and you'll still have some yeah, at least there's this rug that pulls everything together that where you know you'll find stuff, right?
Right.
I mean, anything you've lost, you can just say, did you check the rug, or did you check the aggregates? It must be in there. With DCB, you kind of lose that, right? With DCB, it could literally be anywhere, and you don't have an aggregate. So basically, there's a command handler. Instruction comes in, and that command handler takes whatever information it needs from the event store, and you have to more or less define upfront what events are relevant. For example, if you, well, the example we always use are student in courses, right? But if you want to enroll a student, number one, on course with identifier A, then you'll know you'll need the events of student one and the course of the course A that are related to enrollment. And then you can check limits, you can check whatever. So those, that's more or less the definition you provide. But when you do this CRUD approach, what is relevant? Well, all the update events, and then things just get messier. Yeah. And one thing I love, let me turn it down to the positive.
Positive, right.
One thing I love, and that's something that framework always already does. I would love to say it was designed that way, but it just evolved in that way. Is when you do things wrong, the framework will tell you, and it won't say, hey, you're doing it wrong, unfortunately, but it will become really awkward. And somebody once told me that, you know, in the framework, when you have a feeling that you're swimming upriver, that means you're going in the wrong direction, right? It should be, if it's not smooth for you, you're doing something wrong.
Wrong, right.
And we currently cannot really predict how DCB and swimming upstream will feel, and that's also why we are working so hard on these different approaches, or at least design methodologies, right? Promoting design methodologies that fit very well with event sourcing, like event modeling.
Right.
Martin Dilger recently, well, quite a while ago,
published a book.
I think a book about it, Understanding Event Sourcing, and I forced myself to read it, and it sounds like it was a penalty, or I say that
a chore.
A chore.
Yeah, right.
But it was actually quite funny because he said that he wanted to write the book that he wanted to have 5 years ago. I wanted to have that book 10 years ago.
Right.
15 years ago.
The things not to do.
Exactly.
To do, yeah.
And it describes it very well, but I think it was exactly the right time to write that book. It's been on the #1 bestsellers position.
I think since it came out, since before
for
officially
5 or 6 weeks since it came out, I think, and now it's down to 7. It's an old book now.
Right.
But it is actually really good because it's extremely practical. I'm a very practical person, right? I love blah, blah, but if it doesn't get you stuff into production, either better, faster, or more reliably, I don't care about it, right? And this I can definitely recommend. I mean, I'll recommend it anywhere. I've gone through front to back. There's nothing I fundamentally disagree with. There's some opinions, and he clearly states those are opinions, and I think that's good. But he also describes this process of event modeling and going step by step. And if you follow that process, it doesn't matter whether you use aggregates or not, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And I think that event modeling and aggregates are actually not that good of friends.
No.
So,
and I think, because event modeling gives you a lot of great detail and information upfront.
Yeah.
So when you're going into your code IDE, whatever, wherever you're about to produce that code, it's going to be a lot easier because you have the information up front. But, a lot of times, and this will be a conversation for a whole other session, but one of the things that I want to come back to is, how do we make things easier? And we'll talk a little bit about how to make event modeling possibly easier into the process of, designing applications. But before I go there, we talked about the framework and how the framework can help. How about the server? Because I know there's a lot of work that the server team is currently doing in implementing DCB. Why on the server, and how does that work exactly on the server? And why do we care?
Yeah,
It's a server, it's a message router, and an event
an
store,
event store. Yeah.
right?
Well, the big challenge is, well, the message routing doesn't change for DCB. It just
Right.
remains exactly the same. The way we store events, or at least interact with the storage, will change in DCB. So where the event sourcing options we used to have in, or we still have in the traditional event sourcing approach, is based on a stream identifier, or in our case, an aggregate identifier, right? We explicitly name it aggregate identifier, but in other event store implementations, it's called stream ID. Great. And that's the way you get events, right? You pass in a stream ID, and then you get the events that were once upon a time appended with that particular stream ID. With DCB, that changes, because you don't have conceptual streams anymore. Now, an event is about something, right? It is related to certain relevant concepts. And in the student and course example, it's the student and the course. So if a student 1 enrolled for course A, your event will describe 1 and describe A. And those are what we call tags, right? You tag your event with those two. And that means you can find that event either by providing your interest, or indicating your interest in student 1, or course A, right?
Yeah.
And you can say, I want the intersection, so only events that talk about both, or events that talk about either of those. And so the way you query it becomes a little bit more elaborate. There's more options. Dynamic. Hey, that's a nice word, dynamic. We should include that in the acronym.
I know, right? How did we come up with that?
Yeah, it becomes more dynamic. And then anything you make dynamic becomes a performance bottleneck. And that's where we said we do not accept a performance penalty, right? We do not.
So how did we resolve that?
Really cool concept, and then pay a performance penalty on the backside.
Right.
We resolve that by spending a lot of engineering hours on finding the right way to implement that. Of course, the trick is ultimately in how you store the tags, how you store the events, how you retrieve that information. Make sure you don't need to go back and forth to a disk to find something, because that will slow it down.
Yeah.
But of course, I can't go into any further detail than that.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Now, from the users' side of things, would our users then need to configure all of these different things, like, whichever tags you want, or does it sort of come out of the box ready to use?
Yeah, there's some things that you will have to configure in the framework. You would typically annotate those if you use an annotation approach, because Axon 5 will be much more non-annotation friendly.
Also dynamic.
Also very dynamic. Right? Yes, we call it layered APIs, where you can use a very low level APIs, or you can go up where things become easier, and just one line of configuration that does a lot of stuff under the hood for you.
Yeah.
And annotations are an example of that. So you will be able to annotate fields and just say, okay, I want the value of this field to become a tag, and it will look at the field name, or does the annotation provide an explicit name, because tags are a combination of name and value. So that will become easy. And one of the things, and this is the part where the consistency comes in the boundary, is that when it's not just when reading events that you have a difference, but when you append events, there's also this opportunity to get conflicts, right? So if two applications at the same time enroll a student to the same course, you might not want to. So they both want to publish a student enrolled event. Right?
Yeah.
So the first one to arrive will not have any conflicts, because nothing happened in the meantime. But when the second one arrives, there is an event that, had the application that made that decision known the other event was there, it might have made a different decision. So that is what we call a conflict, right?
Gotcha.
Is
Yeah.
any event that might have influenced the decision to publish whatever you just published. And to be able to detect that, you have to, again, provide tags and certain conditions.
Yep.
And that is where the framework has you completely covered. You don't have to think about what those conditions are, because it can build that based on the information you've gathered to make your decision.
Yep.
And then when you publish a decision, it knows, okay, this is the information I gathered. This is how I selected my information. So this is how I define any conflict.
That's powerful. And, it seems like we are on our way, well in our way to making event sourcing easier.
Yeah, and it will still be too
Better.
hard for certain
For some.
scenarios, and we'll be working on that next. Yeah,
Exactly. Can't win them all in one go, right?
exactly.
We keep improving and learning from especially what the users are using and needing and so on. So we keep moving on, forward. Now, the other topic that I want to talk to you about, which is going to, I think it's a pretty big topic, but maybe we can touch on it today, and then maybe we can come back and talk more about it, is, so when we were talking a little bit about event modeling and how that can also be quite complex, because you do have to put a lot of thought and effort into coming up with what events are actually necessary in your system, which commands, queries, and so on. So you have to basically paint this whole picture of whatever system you're trying to build and then go code it, right? That's a lot of work there. That doesn't make my life easier. I mean, me personally, I love event modeling, so no problem. I'll just put sticky notes all day, every day. But for some, it might be a big hurdle. Now, there's a big buzzword that came about a few years ago called artificial intelligence. That is
Doesn't ring a
something,
bell. Oh.
right? Doesn't ring a bell. That has been something that has made a lot of people's lives easier, right? If you're looking at the way that we are searching things, even on Google or other search platforms, you don't need to necessarily click on every link that pops up. You have this AI assistant comes in and tells you, this is what you need. Now, granted, not always accurate, but helpful, very helpful, right?
Yeah, I was going to say it
takes the
makes
pain away.
some people's lives a lot easier and other people's lives a lot funnier.
A lot funnier or complicated, right? How did that come out? I always joke when, you put a question on ChatGPT and it gives you an answer immediately. And it's very polite too, which is hilarious to me. And then the next question you say, are you sure? It goes, actually, ... Right? So not perfect, but it's getting there better. When we're looking at our tools and our system and how event sourcing can tie well into AI, or does it tie well into AI?
Yeah, well, in different ways it does. Yes.
And again, why should we consider it even, right?
It's so actually the first tie is I want to start in the back. And the first tie, it ties into the why are we making event sourcing easier? Why would we even bother with event sourcing? And there's one thing AI loves. It loves more than anything. It loves more than prompts, and that's data.
Yep.
Right. It eats bites by the dozen. But the thing is that data is a big problem. So we have data engineers, right, cleansing data, spending a lot of time figuring out what something means, and then putting it into a format where any AI tool could reason about that data. We've been doing some experiments with event store data, and you don't need, I'm very sorry for the data engineers, but there's no data engineering needed on those. You can just literally, nowadays with the LLMs, and they've become quite a lot more powerful than they were a couple of years ago. You can actually have a reasonable conversation with most of them nowadays. And you can just feed them chunks of an event store and ask information about it. So I've asked them interesting or summaries of what do you see, And it actually deducts that it was an Axon application merely by the fact that it was a complete event stream. It was, well, it assumed it was complete, I guess.
Mhm.
And it recognized Java convention in certain names. And it said, oh, if it's Java and event sourcing, it must be Axon.
Yeah.
Which
is great, right?
It
Pretty
scored
awesome.
some points on my book. So that's one, right? It produces information that is just very natively usable by LLMs, right? You just download, do a query in Axon server, download it as a file, put it as a prompt attachment in ChatGPT, and ask questions. I mean, this is an exercise for anybody watching this. Just try that. Right?
Just try it. And I think you really should. I don't know if you took screenshots, or I think you did.
Yes.
How you did the same process on ChatGPT and the responses it was giving you, and then the tweaks that you did along the way. That was really neat to see.
It's quite funny. At some point, so I asked it about a bike in The Hague, and it says, "Here's some weather forecast in The Hague." I'm like, okay.
That's not what I asked.
I think you lost me here, but so it's still it's not perfect.
Oh, but you can say, if you're in The Hague riding a bike, you probably want to know about the weather, right? Because the weather in the Netherlands is not, always predictable.
There's no.
Well, it is predictable. It's usually rainy, right? So,
exactly. So it's but it's you get some really good insights. And I asked it for the ones thinking, why are we talking about the bikes? I use my bike rental application, and it has this way of generating a lot of rentals at very rapid succession. And just for test purposes, I have a drop-off location that is a random list of cities. It picks a random one from a list of cities, and it goes all the way from Belgrade to New York, anything in between, right? It's all over there. Singapore, I think, whatever. Of course, riding a bike from Belgrade to New York is interesting. But in my tool possible.
Yes.
So when you give that information,
but then ChatGPT had a little problem with it, didn't it?
It started suggesting that this might have been test data because it was very the time frames were very short.
Yeah.
So I asked it for the average speed of the bikes, and that's actually pretty cool. You can ask, or it can deduce a lot of information, and it will explain how it got to the average speed.
Yeah.
And it will say, okay, we'll assume it's from the middle to the middle, and then in a straight line, because how do you ride a bike from Amsterdam to New York?
New York. Right.
But the average speed of my bikes was 700 kilometers an hour, which is, I guess, something like 500 miles an hour.
But
it's reasonably fast.
Right. And, aside from it being funny, it shows you that there are a lot of possibilities. Yeah. So even though some things are not considered necessarily within your systems, within your applications, you can still get that information on some other parts of it that maybe you might not have thought about before, or maybe it is kind of interesting to look at from a different lens, from a different perspective.
But more importantly, I think events are, we've said from the start, right? Event sourcing allows you to capture information that is useful for auditing, but also to answer questions you didn't realize you had in the beginning.
Exactly. Yep.
But what do you need to do to get the information out? Well, you have to build a projection and process the information, and no, scratch that. What you need to do is get the information into a large language model and ask a question. Right. And there's a pretty good standard, MCP. I don't want to give anything away, but I will. We've done some experiments with MCP servers for Axon Server. In that case, the LLM will find out whether it needs to query Axon Server. And we've done some experiments by explaining it or giving it explanations on how to query. And it actually comes up with correct queries. To get the right events from the event store and use that information to deduct reasoning. Unfortunately, the models ask for more information that they can actually process within a session sometimes, and then they just lose it. But that's an LLM implementation problem. But the idea is clear, right? We can get information very neatly. And then it's just a matter of imagining what you can do when agents become more evolve a little bit more. AI agents are coming up. So they're very soon you will be able to use the information from your event store directly into your corporate decision-making agents, and they can use that that information and request it whenever they feel they need it. Well, feel, they don't have feelings, but they when they suspect they need it
Like
to make a decision. So that's very powerful, and therefore event sourcing has to be made easy. Otherwise, you can't really grasp the I have to say immense value of
the AI
of AI and event sourcing.
Yeah, and yeah, and hopefully we can in the future, no promises made, but we can maybe use some tooling to make the process of just designing an application all the way to deploying it is so much easier without having to go through all the nitty-gritties. But I know we talked about a half hour. I do want to open it up to our audience members and to questions. So if you have a question, feel free to either post it on the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute, turn your camera on. I think we can do that, Drew, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct, yes.
Perfect. All right, so feel free to ask your questions. Ask away. We have Allard here, so whatever your questions you may have about DCB, or if you have any comments or questions about the AI, or maybe some other things that are on your mind about Framework Server, other tooling that we use.
In the meantime, I'll just briefly talk to the topic that you just discussed, and that's the AI in the process. And there's already a few tools in the making that make event modeling easier using AI. Actually, Martin Dilger, we talked about him earlier about the book. He has a plugin for Miro where you can, in free text, provide some description. It will generate at least a start of events that you can start talking about. Because there's one. Actually, personally, I think that's a very interesting moment when I do an event modeling session. Is this these different levels of awkwardness that the attendees have to go through, right? Is like, oh, nothing is an event. I can't think of a single event. And then, oh, everything is an event, right? Everything that happens, that's actually quite a lot. And they start writing stuff down, and then it's like, no, that's not an event. The fact that user is watching information on the screen is not an event, right? So you have to go through these stages, but going through that, they learn, and then you start the process. But using AI with a natural language description, and then it gets you a head start. At least it's probably wrong, and that's good because it starts the discussion about what is right in that case.
Sure. And because it learns quite quickly and likes to build patterns on the data that you're providing it, it makes things a lot easier, especially when it comes to not only designing applications, but when it comes down to, for instance, the quality of the code that you're producing, testing, operations, all of these things become quite more consistent. And also, I think in a lot of ways, easier in the long run as your applications grow or requirements change and things like that. It can adapt and change. So currently no questions yet, but we are here for another 6 minutes. So Allard, you can, if you like to continue, maybe somebody, and please don't be shy. Allard is very nice. Usually.
Just don't make me make any promises, because then I will not understand the question correctly and just give you another answer. No.
Well, that's okay. You're not that different from ChatGPT in that sense then.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I think the AI discussion is really interesting, especially when it comes to developers, because there's like two sides of it. One side says there's no way vibe coding is not helping me, and well, I'm kind of on that side in some way. I'm quite skeptical still, but also pragmatic. But what I've noticed is that one of the big problems there is that, well, software engineering is such an immensely broad term that if you just do something randomly, based on all of your learning on Stack Overflow, let's be honest, that's probably where most of the
all of your copy pasting,
comes from, right? Yeah. Right. So if that's your school, yes, you will produce some code that doesn't always compile. But the trick is to steer an AI in the right direction. And this is literally, I mean, if you look at the number of parameters that these models use, right, it's billions, and you have to
Yep.
think of this as not a three-dimensional space. That is what we can reason about, but now it's a 6 billion dimensional space, and in that there's this vector, a line pointing at somewhere, and it will just follow. Okay, what is the most likely thing now? And if you do that enough, then you get natural language texts, because that's what it's been trained on. If you imagine finding your way in a random place that you're not familiar with in a three-dimensional space, you already get lost.
Yeah, that's
Now
exactly.
imagine in
Imagine
6
6
billion
billion.
dimensions.
Right.
So that's why some AI start reasoning weirdly, quote unquote, when you don't give them enough context. But if you give them context, you're already saying, okay, I'm interested in this particular space. You can discard the rest of it. That's not interesting, but this is what I want you to do. And the more specific you are, the better the results are.
Right.
And I feel that this is also where actually event modeling, event modeling is really good at defining very clear slices of your application. And I feel that those are great structures, right? And we can make language structures out of those. And if you can create language structures out of those, you can have an LLM generate them. I mean, that's the reasoning. So I think there's a very interesting future ahead with AI in combination with coding, I guess.
Yes, really, really interesting and powerful tools to use now and also coming up. I think we have a lot of potential and a lot of promise there.
So anyone who wants to know a lot more about this, I can definitely recommend checking our website and subscribing for or registering for the conference on October 1 and 2. There will be some interesting announcements in this space.
Yeah.
That's
and I'm actually really, really glad you're bringing this up. And I think one of the other places that you can find more information, at least from Allard's perspective, is on LinkedIn. So you do, I want to say like, but I think that's a very strong word. But you have gotten used to producing material, right? What is it? Tuesdays and Fridays is when you
mostly Fridays, and yeah, sometimes when my Tuesday isn't that terrible, I will post them as well. But usually it's the Friday FUD for event sourcing. I always discuss one of the topics that came up where people had fear, uncertainty, and doubts. There's always these questions that pop up. What about, and how do I, and help, this can't work, it will never work. And I will discuss those topics. So
absolutely. So very good. I'm glad you brought up some resources. Oh, another resource that I wanted to point out is what you mentioned, your bike rental application. It is on GitHub. It's a public repository. So anybody who's interested, find Allard on GitHub. And do you have the link handy right now, Allard?
No, I don't. It's on
or is it just like
it's
Allard Buijze
/ bike rental extended
dash
with
rental,
dashes.
I think. Yeah, check it out. And if you don't know where to find it, we actually, if you go to our console, it's console.axonic.io, you would be able to go in there, and there's a sample application, which is actually the bike rental application. So you can check that out there as well. And check out the console while you're there and see what it can do for your applications, and maybe hook you up with the server for free, which is awesome. I think aside from that, we're coming to the end of our session. I really appreciate everybody being here. Join me next month as I'll be talking to Andy Whitaker, who is one of our longtime users of Framework and Server, and he's got some really interesting success stories, but also challenges that he's faced in the many years that he's been working with our tools, but also in the realm of event sourcing, CQRS, domain-driven design. He's extremely knowledgeable, cool guy to talk to. So come back and check us out in June. With that said, Allard, thank you so much for coming in, joining me for a cup of coffee or water, I think.
It was
Great to
water,
have you.
Sam. Yeah, there's a limit on the coffee intake.
I know you're a little bit later in the evening, so appreciate that. And thank you everybody else. And if you'd like to see this again, it is recorded. You can check it out on YouTube, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.